So we will start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to UCL Creativity in Technology webinar series. This is the note that if you have any question during the webinar, please leave it in Q&A box. We will select and discuss your questions later in this talk. My name is Noya Tan. I am the organizer of this webinar series, and I am also a UCL PhD student investigating social cognition and creativity in Dr. Harris' lab. First, please let me introduce this whole event. When we talk about creativity, we can easily think about creativity in music, in drawing, in writing, or in designing. However, we can rarely associate this capability with engineering problem solving. Okay, even though we can see innovations and some amazing projects, we can rarely feel creativity in our own problem solving process. And this is the reason that we conduct this event, in which we have academics from various backgrounds, and they will not only talk about their research, but also the application of creativity in their working process. And the key message that we really wanted to deliver to you in this event is that creativity can be unlocked for everyone, and this ability is important in all the domains. We have many audience from various backgrounds. So first, thank you very much for registering on our event. From now to the end of this month, I will be here with you on every Friday, watching speakers' presentations and interview them. We will have 7 webinars, and today is our first one, which is given by Dr. Oonagh Murphy. So, Dr. Murphy is an arts manager and a writer. She is also a lecturer in arts management at Goldsmiths University. Currently, Dr. Murphy sits on the Culture Committee of the London Irish Centre, and she is the principal investigator of an AHRC-funded project called Museums plus AI Network. So today, she will give us a talk about AI, museums, and creativity. The first part of this webinar is Dr. Murphy's presentation about this topic, and the second part is the interview. This webinar will last in 30 minutes. Just in case, it may extend for maximum 5 minutes. So now let's welcome Dr. Murphy.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon. And thank you for that introduction. I'm really delighted to be here today. Slightly intimidated because I'm not an engineer and I'm speaking to a lot of engineers today. But I hope that my insights from a different perspective and my discussion around creativity and what that looks like in the field of museum studies, arts management, and the creative industries might spark some new ideas. And I think interdisciplinary practice is a really exciting way to work and develop new practices. So, as the introduction said, I am a lecturer in arts management at the Institute for Creative and Cultural Entrepreneurship at Goldsmiths University of London. And my research centres on digital culture and the impact it has on the cultural sector. I'm co-founder of the Museums and AI Network, which I established with Elena Villa Espasa, assistant professor at Pratt Institute in 2019. And the work of the network really forms the foundation of what I'm going to talk about today. My talk really examines artificial intelligence from the perspective of theory and practice, looking at dystopia, utopia, and that middle ground of lived reality. Along the way, I'll examine some key definitions and highlight some examples of museum practitioners that I think are developing really interesting approaches to using AI technologies. So when I was asked to do this talk today, and we were talking about what should it focus on, what's the angle we should look at, and so I've decided to look at the relationship between AI, museums, and creativity. So let's get back to it. Yeah, so the relationship between AI and museums and creativity is a really interesting space to examine these new technologies. AI is really having a moment. It's in our homes, it's in our workplaces. It helps us to navigate around our cities, and it's already being used by many visitors to museums and galleries. But then that's the challenge. How can museums and libraries and galleries engage with these emerging technologies in a socially responsible and ethically robust way? Because the premise of my work within the cultural sector is this idea that museums and cultural institutions are social purpose institutions. They exist in the service of society. They're not commercial operators. And actually that places really great challenges when it comes to engaging with these new technologies. When it comes to discussing AI, the conversation often turns to contradictory narratives, utopian dreams where work is carried out by machines as we enjoy a constant life of leisure. And in contrast to that is this narrative of a dystopian future where freedom and creativity have vanished, or a totalitarian robot state has taken over. But the reality is likely to be more nuanced, and indeed already is. It exists somewhere between the utopian and the dystopian fiction that prevail in popular culture. Indeed, in 2020, neither utopian nor dystopian narratives fully depict the use of machine learning in our everyday lives. Machine learning helps to filter the spam from my inbox, and it attempts to help me structure emails. Citymapper and Google Maps help me to travel in the most efficient way possible, responding to live conditions and recalibrating my journey as I move. On the web, my search results are improved, meaning that I find what I'm looking for quickly, but limiting any serendipitous opportunity for discovery, whether that's to find an article about an unknown female scientist or a local hairdresser who doesn't pay to advertise online. The thousands of photos I take on my phone on a monthly basis are neatly tagged and categorized so I can search for pictures of my birthday or look for the picture I took of a receipt during my last work trip. However, this search function isn't perfect. As you'll see from this slide, the bottom pictures are actually from my family Christmas last year. I think the machine vision tool saw the candles and decided that meant it was a birthday. Alexa and an extension Amazon employees are listening to users' conversations, but Alexa, can't really understand my Irish accent. And my arguments with her seem to outweigh any useful assistance Alexa provides. So where are we today? I think it's safe to say AI filters my life and my experience is more efficient for it, which is a good thing. But the trade-off for an efficient life is less opportunity for discovery and a life viewed through the prism of those that programmed the machine. It's fair to say that the landscape is complicated, and within a museum perspective, efficiency serves one purpose, but discovery serves another. And creativity and discovery are central to the social purpose of museums and cultural institutions. And so here lies the challenge for cultural institutions. How can they engage with these emerging technologies to support their work, to develop their collections, to engage with their audiences and visitors, but also to support creativity and discovery, to encourage visitors to ask critical questions of new technologies, but also of the technology companies that they engage with when they adopt and use these technologies. So what does this look like? What does AI look like? What types of AI technologies are currently being used in museums? I'm going to go through a couple of different examples that utilize a range of different approaches to artificial intelligence. On this screen, you can see two virtual educators who answered visitors' questions, suggested exhibits, and explained the technology that made them using natural language processing. A really interesting example when we think about that dichotomy, that challenge between efficiency and creativity. This interface is efficient, it provides answers to visitors, but it's also creative and critical because it explains the technology behind it. The work of Mario Klingman is becoming increasingly significant within the wider art market. And from a cultural production perspective, his work has now been auctioned at a number of world-leading auction houses. He has taken a variety of different approaches, but is most well known for his work using GANs, or generative adversarial networks. His algorithm was trained using thousands of portraits from the 17th and 19th century, and through this process was taught its own aesthetic preferences using a Tinder-like selection application. Using its memories of the component of a face, the machine works to generate new portraits, occasionally struggling and blending what is an essential requirement for a human face, and other times getting it point accurate, that it becomes difficult to decipher what is an original painting and what is a GAN created work. The National Museum of African Art and the wider Smithsonian Institution has been engaging with a robotic company to enlist Pepper, a humanoid robot, to engage with visitors across their different sites using a variety of different approaches. At the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Pepper helps to welcome visitors and orientate visitors to the Rosa Parks virtual reality experience. While at the National Museum of African Art, Pepper will translate Kiswahili phrases into English. Sometimes museums are engaging in the use of machine vision technologies as a way to help visitors engage with and discover their collections. Remember, most museums display 5 to 10% of their collection at any one time. And as such, for museums to truly engage with collections, the online collection database becomes very important. Cooper Hewitt, which is the Smithsonian Design Museum, realized that color was an important search feature for designers that wanted to engage with design history as a way to provoke and prompt new ways of seeing the world today. And so they worked with Dr. Olivia Vian to develop a search function based on color using machine vision technologies. What would be considered probably quite an early example of AI technologies in museums would be the TaiK Prize, which commissioned a group of artists to develop a machine vision tool that live analysed news imagery, so photographs that had been used in the news that day, and made recommendations and matches with the Tait's collection. The matching process and the reasons why the computer saw similarities were documented and analysed in a public exhibition in the Tate Britain Gallery. But as I said, not all of this is visitor facing, and some of it exists behind the scenes. The Science Museum has been engaging with and exploring different approaches to using machine vision technologies to help create more metadata on their online collections to make it more searchable and usable by visitors and researchers. In doing that, John Stack has developed a tool that allows members of the public, so the link is there, to click through the museum's collection database and see what a number of machine vision tools see alongside their degree of accuracy. And so you can see here in this image that the machine is pretty sure that it's identified a jar and a plastic bag, which serves some purpose. It is useful. They are those things. But in a more specific perspective for a museum, this is actually a specimen jar. So the key component in terms of the object's identity is what's within the jar. And that at present is beyond the capacity of the machine vision tools. National Gallery has engaged in the predictive analytics as a means of being able to predict and identify how many visitors they will have through their door on any given day. They use a range of varying data points from that, which includes the popularity of an artist, the time of the year, the marketing spend, and also how far through the run of the exhibition they are at the time of the prediction. And what's interesting about this model is that actually any member of the museum has access to this dashboard. So very much using these AI technologies or predictive analytics to empower all staff within their building to understand their visitor flow better. So you can see from these perspectives that there's a really wide variety of AI technologies currently being used in museums and galleries. And as the possibilities that these technologies offer us increase, so too do the challenges of developing and managing these technologies within the context of galleries, libraries, museums, and archives. And in this slide, you can see a list of questions that we have refined. We've divided them into two areas. One focuses on collections data, and one focuses on AI in relation to visitor flow and management. And these questions served as the foundation or the problem statement from which we developed the Museums and AI Network, which was led by Goldsmiths, Pratt Institute, the National Gallery, the Met, and the American Museum of Natural History. And the network sought to develop new ways of working. It sought to ask provocative questions about the dichotomy between what is possible and what is ethically robust for social purpose institutions. So I'm going to click through some slides quickly so we have time for discussion. Through the network, we engaged with 50 experts. We worked with 6 universities, 15 museums, 200 members of the public. We facilitated a really wide range of approaches to workshops. We had some very small working groups where we invited senior digital managers in museums and a number of key academics to debate and discuss the challenges of regulation alongside ethical codes of practice from our own member bodies. We also had public events, and this is a format called the Long Table that invites anyone to join the table and become an expert. These public conversations, this is another example of one that we held in New York at the Cooper Hewitt, were really important in ensuring that we could develop a robust conversation that engaged with those that we sought to develop relationships with, that being our visitors. That two-way negotiation is documented quite nicely here by Muriel Royal in a sketch note. So the aim of this work was to turn theory into practice. And we ran a series of workshop formats. We piloted a range of different workflow models and worksheets that sought to embed ethical and critical thinking into the development of AI projects throughout their life cycle. We tested these early prototypes with senior digital managers, and then we refined those models further. After we carried out the workshops, we took the worksheets home, and we identified areas where there was boxes missing, where we hadn't asked questions. And what we've developed as a result of this network and the questions and the case studies is an openly available and free to access toolkit that provides a series of case studies. It outlines questions around AI from an ethical perspective, and also a series of worksheets and planning tools to help cultural organizations develop their approach to using AI. Crucially, the toolkit also includes a detailed glossary that has been written specifically for the cultural sector, with each definition or each terminology in the glossary being accompanied by a specific example of what this looks like in a cultural institution. So with that, I am going to conclude my presentation, and I'm going to open myself to questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murphy. I think it sounds great. I mean, if you have any question, specifically in Dr. Murphy's research area, you can always send email to her, right? Yeah, but for me, because it must fit the this topic is about creativity. So I want to ask some question in terms of the creative, ideation process in your work. So the first one is that, in your workshop, I know that you've worked with many artists and people from museums in your workshop. So could you please share us an example of the ideation process that works very well in your group, in your like for your creativity generation?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we found really interesting was that we created quite an open approach to programming our events. So in developing these tools, we were led by participants. So we generated the problem statement that I showed in this presentation, and we sent that out to participants, and we asked, would you like to be involved in events that respond to this? When they said yes, we then put them to work. So we went back to them and said, we're going to have our first event at Goldsmiths. It will be 2 days long. We would like you to speak for 15 minutes about things that you don't understand, or things that don't work for you, or challenges that you face. And what was quite interesting about this approach, we deliberately kept it under 40 people. Everyone agreed in the room that conversations would be private and wouldn't go any further. And this was quite radically different, because in cultural institutions, and I think academia more generally, we go to conferences to present finished projects. We talk about what went well. And actually our framing on this event series was, come and tell us what troubles you. Come and tell us what you want to do, but you can't do. And we took a very adaptive and responsive format, which was led by our participants.
So it's really like a participant-centered workshop. So it's very interactive for them, right? It's not like you just like input some knowledges. It's really like you're inspiring them. You're leading a like very interactive workshop. Yes, and yeah, sorry.
No, so I was just going to say exactly that. And I think one of the really important things in terms of collaborative and interdisciplinary work when it comes to creativity, it has to be a reciprocal process. So as an academic, I'm really interested in how these areas develop. But I also know that those that I work with are really busy. They have really demanding jobs. And so for them to commit to be part of our network, they had to see a potential benefit. So in the development of our tools and our workshop, our work processes, our worksheets, the glossary, all of these tools were something that they could take back to their institution. And so we developed a number of worksheets and a number of workshops that people weren't interested in, or they were like, I wouldn't use that. We knew we were onto something good when people started to steal our worksheets. Or they said, oh, can I take this home with me? And we would say, oh, no, it's a pilot. Like, we want to take your notes. So then they would photograph it and take it away. So I think that understanding the motivation of participants in any mode of collaborative development is really important, because if there was no incentive for participation, then it becomes very much a passive model, and you don't have those collaborative design outcomes.
Yeah, when you talk about like motivation, like I think it's very like accurate, like because even for like our like creativity research, we know that the intrinsic motivation, like you enjoy the process, is one of the most important thing for being creative. And I have a like second question is about, it's not a negative part, like it's something, it may constrain your creativity, because you talked about ethical issues in your like domain. I think it's the same for engineering field, and even for our field, like the ethical issues, sometimes it restrains our creativity somehow. So what do you think the role of the ethical issues in your domain?
Yeah, so I think for me, it restrains quick adoption of technologies. But I think what it facilitates is creative and challenging ways of developing a dialogue with these technologies. And so I think from a museum perspective, it actually creates really interesting curatorial conversations around how objects are collected, how data is collected in museums, thinking about racial bias around colonialism. These are all inherent issues within the museum already. And those wider museology conversations that we have, embedding them into new technologies, actually creates a really interesting space for new ways of working that actually can influence wider society, and I think technology companies as well.
think like, yes, I think like we have some relevant like questions from the audience. And this is a question like, so you mentioned that I think it's a bit like relevant to this. It's about the efficiency and discovery. So you mentioned the tension between efficiency and discovery, and you gave some examples of efficiency, right? I think it's already also like relevant to the ethical things. And I wonder like this, participants wonder if you have more example of AI that nurtures discovery and curiosity or creativity for museum audience. So a lot of them seems to be examples of how artists use AI creatively more than creative audience interaction itself. So what do you think? So what do you think about this? Like,
yeah. So what we have to remember with museum collections, museums are not neutral. Museums are inherently biased. And so if you search a museum's online collections database, you are searching through bias to get to the answer. So quite often, the metadata that exists around museum collections online comes from a colonial history. And so the only way that you will find the object you're looking for is if you use that historic language, because that is the language that is associated with the object. And so machine vision technologies can further create what we define as bias squared. So machine vision technology bias, when it meets museum bias, can be problematic. But actually, if machine vision technologies are developed in a more ethically and socially responsive way, they could also be used as a corrective tool to create new metadata that uses indigenous language and understands traditional cultures and religious structures in a way and the language that is relevant to those that own those objects, and not in the language of those that took and often stole those objects.
If I understand it correctly, do you mean that like you can sometimes use those, like biases or constraints to generate your creative performance or something?
Exactly, yeah.
And I have another question. It's about the current situation. I think one of our audience asked, so in the current coronavirus pandemic, so how do you think this kind of situation would impact or change the way that how museums support creativity? So how I think it definitely like affect the current situation of museums, but is there are there like positive effect as well or negative ones?
Yeah, so I think what we've seen over the last number of years is digital really moved from the periphery to the core of museums and cultural institutions. Traditionally, there was a digital department. And we're slowly moving to a digital by default model in which digital is not a nice to have or an additional service, but instead it is intrinsically linked to all production within a museum. And so I think that will become further centralized in response to COVID. What I suspect we will see more of in the next couple of years will be a move towards digital programming. And by that, I mean public programming and education rather than coding. So I think we will see more online talks, more virtual tours, more opportunities to participate with museums remotely. So a museum, and I think it's in Netherlands, the Van Aben Museum, for the past at least 5 years, if not longer, has been using a robotics tool to allow disabled visitors or visitors with access needs to visit the museum remotely. So they basically can control iPad on wheels, and they can choose how long they look at an artwork. They can choose what direction they go in. And I think we'll see more emphasis on that. However, I also suspect that the COVID and the shift towards digital may actually slow down some of the back-end digital work. So I think AI, when it serves visitor needs from a front-facing perspective and a quick perspective, will be enhanced. But I think some of the more structural work around collections and collections data and ethics may actually be slowed down because it will be seen as a secondary concern.
Yeah, the secondary, yes, I think it makes sense. You know, like still the ethical thing, like it's another context for us. Again, like the social context will be different. So there are more issues we need to solve and we need to adjust it to fit that one. And this is almost the end. And I have one more question. So if you have other questions for Dr. Murphy, I think we have some of them, like we don't have time to answer, but please email Dr. Murphy. And now the last one, I think some of you may interest is that, so you mentioned the toolkit in your workshop and in your project. Could you please talk about it for a little bit so we know like what is it about, and then we can just search it maybe after this workshop, after this talk, sorry.
Yes, I have. Oh, I don't think, do I have access? I don't think I have access to chat, do I? I don't think I do.
Oh yes, we don't have the chat. Maybe I'll send the link to them.
Yes, I was going to post the link, but you can send the link. Yes, so the toolkit is, as I say, it's free to download. And again, actually, the reason it exists, I guess, in some ways does come back to creativity and motivation. I think many of the people here will be academics. I see some of my undergrad students have joined. Hello to them. Academic publishing can be very slow. And the technologies that we were researching over the last year are moving very fast. So the toolkit was produced, it was published by Goldsmiths University. It's a printed publication that looks something like this. This is my slightly battered copy, but you can also download the PDF. And the reason we created this was to give something back to those who participated. So we wanted this to be a really well-used, well-worn document that people would have on their desk and they could take notes on. The toolkit contains a frequently asked questions section. It talks a little bit about different considerations and things that you need to think about when you're looking at AI. It has a number of case studies which really talk through the management processes of why cultural institutions chose to engage with these technologies, what the challenges were, but also what the payoff and benefits were. And then it concludes with these worksheets, which I mentioned. So it's very much designed to be a practical working document. We have said to everyone that uses it, please give us feedback. We will likely develop further and work from it. And the toolkit sits as a body of practice alongside our academic writing and publications on this. So for some of those watching, maybe more junior academics, to give you a time frame in terms of publication cycle, we completed this project in 2019, kind of January to December. We submitted our first book chapter in October 2019. We've just had it signed off this week, and it will be published in December 21. We have a journal article that we're doing a final revision on now that we hope will come out in autumn 2020. And we have a book proposal that we've been working on for about 6 months now that has been moving around publishers. We were expecting it to have been commissioned already. I think now that looks like that's not going to happen to autumn. So the book from this 2019 research will likely come out in 2022. So it's an interesting process whenever you're working with emerging technologies. The toolkit from an academic perspective is a body of practice, but equally not seen as prestigious as a peer-reviewed journal article. However, for us and our approach to collaborative practice, actually the toolkit is probably one of the most important things that we will produce out of this project.
I think this is basically this toolkit itself is a very creative way to communicate in both academia and in industry. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Murphy, for sharing your research, your ideas, and your experience with us. I do learn a lot from you today, and I'll definitely look at your toolkit after this. And I hope our audience, you guys also get inspired from Dr. Murphy, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Thank you. Bye.